Have you ever just stopped and wondered about that silent, invisible force that's generating your every single thought, your feelings, your decisions? I mean, it's the most complex object in the entire known universe, and it lives right between your ears. So today, we're going to dive in and explore the incredible biology that makes you, well, you.
And really, this is the fundamental question, right? It's not just about what you do, but what it actually feels like to be you, to live your life from the inside out. It's the huge mystery of subjective experience. And believe it or not, the answer starts with a number that's almost too big to wrap your head around.
That's 86 billion. 86 billion neurons packed inside your skull. Every single one is a tiny biological computer. But here's the kicker. It's not even the number of cells that's so mind-blowing, it's the connections they make with each other.
To put that into perspective for you, the most powerful AI models we have today, they run on maybe 1 to 2 trillion parameters. Your brain, it's operating on somewhere between 100 and 500 trillion synaptic connections. That is just hundreds of times more complex. But raw power isn't the whole story. The real magic is in how it's all organized.
Okay, so let's get into it. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the deep mystery of consciousness itself. Then we'll move into the brain's physical hardware, see how that maps onto personality, compare the two leading models out there, and then we'll finish up by looking at what all of this means for the future of psychology.
So, first up, the ghost in the machine. How does all this biological stuff, this literal wetware, give rise to the incredibly rich inner world that we all experience every single day? This is, without a doubt, one of the biggest unanswered questions in all of science.
It's actually called the hard problem of consciousness. You see, the easy problems are things like, explaining how we process vision or how we control our arms and legs. The hard problem is explaining why we experience the color red or feel the sting of sadness. Why isn't it all just happening in the dark, without an inner audience watching the show?
There was this philosopher, Thomas Nagel, who framed it perfectly with this one simple question. We can understand the physics of echolocation, right? We can study it, we can map it, but we can never, ever truly know the subjective experience, what it actually feels like to be a bat, navigating the entire world through sound. That feeling, that inner life, that's consciousness. And the source material for this explainer offers a brilliant way to think about this from information theory. Imagine you have 50 marbles. If you arrange them into a pyramid, the information is pyramid. But if you rearrange those exact same 50 marbles into the shape of a banana, the information becomes banana. The matter, the marbles, they're identical. But the pattern, the arrangement, that's everything. Your consciousness isn't in your atoms or your neurons. It's in the incredibly complex, dynamic patterns they form from moment to moment. All right, so let's see how this all builds up. Moving from the philosophical down to the physical. What are the rules and the resources that actually govern this incredible biological machine? This is just staggering. Your brain is only about 2% of your body weight, but it devours 20% of your resting energy. Think about that. Thinking is an incredibly expensive activity, metabolically speaking, and all of that energy is just fueling this constant storm of electrical and chemical signals.
Now this is where things get really interesting, because this clears up a huge misconception. We hear all the time about dopamine and serotonin, but they aren't actually the thought chemicals. The real heavy lifting, the carrying of specific information from A to B, that's done by neurotransmitters. Neuromodulators, like dopamine and serotonin, they're different. They don't carry the message itself. They act more like a volume dial for entire brain networks. They create the right chemical environment for certain types of thinking to happen. They literally set the stage. You can almost picture the brain structure as an upside-down pyramid. At the very base, you've got the central nervous system, all the wiring to the body. Then just above that is the brainstem, handling all the basic life support stuff. Then comes the limbic system for emotion and memory. And finally, sitting right at the top, the star of the show, the cortex. That's where all our higher order thinking happens.
And that cortex, it's dominated by 3 massive, interconnected networks. Think of the salience network as your brain's switchboard, constantly deciding, hey, this is important, pay attention to this. Then there's the default mode network. That's the storyteller. It lights up when you're daydreaming or thinking about yourself and other people. And finally, the central executive network. That's the problem solver. It engages when you really need to focus and apply logic and reason.
So, okay, how do we get from these big general networks to individual personalities, to you? Well, this is where models like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or MBTI, come into the picture. It's basically an attempt to map the habitual ways that we each use these different neural systems.
Now look, I know the MBTI often gets a bad rap in some circles, but the source makes a really powerful argument here. It says it wasn't just Carl Jung, it was Catherine Briggs and her daughter Isabel Myers who took Jung's kind of abstract ideas and hammered them into a coherent system. They were true pioneers in mapping out cognition, and just dismissing their work as simple pop psychology really misses their massive contribution.
And this right here is where it all clicks into place.
It shows how their model maps directly onto the neuroscience. That whole thinking versus feeling dichotomy, it's not arbitrary. It's a direct reflection of those two competing networks we just talked about. The Central Executive Network, the CEN, is the seat of logic. That's the thinker. And the Default Mode Network, the DMN, is the seat of story and empathy. That's the feeler. They're even modulated by different chemicals, and you just can't run both at full power at the same time. So over our lives, we develop a preference.
And that same basic logic, that idea of a preferred way of operating, it just extends to all the other functions that build out your profile. It's all about preferences. Do you prefer to take in information through concrete sensing or more abstract intuition? Where do you get your energy? From your inner world, like an introvert, or the outer world, like an extrovert? All these pairs combine to create a really detailed cognitive blueprint.
But hey, Myers-Briggs isn't the only game in town. The other major personality model, especially in academic psychology, is the Big Five. And the key thing to understand is that they aren't competitors. They're really designed for two completely different jobs.
So the source gives us the absolute perfect analogy for this. Think of Myers-Briggs as a schematic of the engine under the hood of your car. It describes your deep, relatively static cognitive wiring, which makes it great for stuff like career guidance. The Big Five, on the other hand, is like the car's dashboard. It measures your current observable behaviors, your mood, your habits, how agreeable you are, which are much more fluid and really useful for things like therapy and personal growth. Engine versus dashboard.
And you can see how it all lines up. The Big Five trait of agreeableness maps right onto the activity of the DMN, which is the feeling function. Conscientiousness maps onto the CEN, the thinking function. Neuroticism is basically the same thing as the turbulence versus assertiveness scale. You see? They're just measuring the behavioral output of the very same underlying systems.
So, this brings us to a much bigger and maybe even more critical point. If all of these connections are so clear, why aren't they at the very center of how we teach and practice psychology?
The source argues that there's a fundamental disconnect in modern psychology education. Students can literally earn a degree in the field without ever being required to learn about the DMN, the CEN, and the salience network, the very foundations of our cognition. And the source suggests that by failing to ground psychology in its physical, neurological reality, the field is missing a huge tool in its toolbox for addressing our ongoing mental health challenges.
So what's the big takeaway here? What do we do with all of this? Is that we are born with a certain cognitive engine, a hardwiring that makes us natural specialists. And that part of us is pretty stable. But our behavior, our dashboard readings, are incredibly flexible and they respond to our environment. Understanding this duality, that people have a core nature, but that their actions can and do change, that is the absolute key to empathy. It reminds us that we're all a product of both our wiring and our world.
And that leaves us with one final thought. These different cognitive types, they didn't evolve by accident. They evolved to create balanced, effective teams. We need the thinkers and the feelers. We need the big picture planners and the detail-oriented specialists. So the real question isn't just about understanding ourselves as individuals, but about using that understanding to build systems and communities and a world that truly leverages our collective strength.